But let's start off with Lynden, this quite small American town known for being Dutch, known for being very Reformed and Christian. Has it always been such a rosy picture? Or
Well, no community history ever is really a rosy picture.
No.
There's a lot of people that move here, certainly these days, for perceived cultural traditions, and I'm all for it. It's the traditions that they're perceiving are good traditions. It's unfortunate that many of them don't understand why those traditions exist, and I think that's probably usually the reason that you see communities change, is because a new group of people will move in. They don't have the cultural frame of reference, and so consequently, while they may have moved in because they like their traditions, they don't understand the traditions, and so consequently don't carry those traditions forth the way they would if it was part of the culture that they originally grew up in or had an understanding of.
is this some like immigration problem? Are the immigrants the problem here?
Well, certainly. I mean, you could broaden that out to an immigration situation. I'm not just talking Lynden, but I mean just the history of the United States, general immigration, and how that has affected U.S. history and with changing communities. One of the ones I'd previously talked about was a Chinese history professor at Tacoma Community College. One of those professors that sort of caught my attention for history and culture. He talked a lot about early Chinatown on the West Coast, the Chinatowns on the West Coast. And that was one of the things he talked about, was how much those Chinatowns changed because there were multiple waves of generational immigrants coming in. And so when you have a community in which has had an immigration come in, they know the piece, the next generation knows it. The new group of immigrants coming in may not necessarily know why it's being done that way, and so consequently, it becomes difficult to explain. Probably the best known piece in the case of Lynden is Sundays, at closures on Sundays, drinking and dancing on Sundays, drinking on Sundays. These pieces, because they're the most recent in Lynden's history and probably the most pervasive of Lynden's history. It's a discussion that was going on before the Dutch even arrived here.
No kidding. It is interesting because, with the whole, just the generational aspects. Like, I get with the migrants point, but then at the same time, when you have people who come in and the generations that come by, they either assimilate, they become the dominant culture, or they homogenize into something entirely different, which, and like, you can look at Caribbean histories and
Caribbean histories are a great example of that.
Yeah. You have entire languages where, like the Pidgin and Creole languages specifically, where there are these amalgamations of different cultures, different tradition, different languages, and you get something completely new.
You talk to people in Europe and they'll say, like, that's exactly what English American is.
Yeah.
We use more Germanic, Slavic, things than any English speaker in England.
No, absolutely. And I'm Canadian. I was born there and I grew up in Ottawa. So it's right on the Quebec border. And Quebec's probably one of the most, historically speaking, interesting societies to ever come around, because one of the things about languages is that they always change. And there's only ever been, as far as I'm aware, one exception to a language that's not changed for like 300 years. And that's Quebec French. If you go there, it is the same French that they were speaking like 1730 France. The French in France today do not speak that French anymore.
Right.
It's a completely novel, weird culture. And people have tried to write books on it. But
that's a great segue into sort of the Dutch aspect. With the Dutch settling, when the Dutch were arriving and settling in the United States, ultimately then many of them arriving in Lynden, the reason those Dutch came was because Holland at the time was changing drastically. Economically, culturally, it had become a modern country. Okay, and it had become one of the very first global societies.
Holland,
yeah,
really?
Because the Dutch East Indies and the Dutch West Indies were the single two largest trading fleets in the world, and they outnumbered the next biggest trading fleet, the English, by like a factor of 3.
Wow.
Yeah. So if there were 3 English trading ships at a given port, there were going to be 9 Dutch.
Jeez.
Yeah. So the Dutch were one of the first truly, not just, Amsterdam and the Dutch cities were not just some of the first truly global cities. It was the Netherlands as a whole became a community of globalism.
Because I remember before England really rose to dominance in the naval world, it was the Dutch as well.
It was the Dutch. Yeah, the Dutch. When the Dutch never had a military navy that could challenge anything. And the Spanish Navy particularly liked picking on Dutch merchant ships. But then when the English defeated the Spanish, leaving the English as really the only real navy out there, the Dutch said, great, the English aren't going to pick on us. We're going to build more ships. We're going to trade more ports. I mean, the Dutch were the first trading colony for North America, with, of course, New Amsterdam, and I can't remember the other one. New Amsterdam ultimately becomes New York. And then for China as well, because even though the English had taken Hong Kong, wasn't Beijing.
It's the one with all the casinos.
Yes.
It starts with an M. Macau?
I think so, yeah. Yeah, so the Dutch had also already established a large trading colony in Asia by the time the English had. And so the Dutch were the traders of the colonial world. They were the ones that created and supported that global economy. And it all ran through Dutch banks.
Yeah.
And that's the reason Holland is still such a wealthy nation, and is just simply, they're looking at 400 plus years of lots of profits and lots of interest on those profits.
It is funny because I think the closest nation that England obviously took over a third of the world effectively. And there's no other nation quite like England because only the English could do what they did, except for the Dutch.
Yeah, and see, the Dutch never wanted to colonize.
No.
They just wanted to trade.
And like they weren't as isolated as England was, and that probably affected their culture a little bit. But outsized influence on a global scale, huge.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, if you were to look at the influence on globalism that various countries have had, Netherlands is still one of the biggest, and was for many centuries probably was at least in the top three.
Oh, for sure.
The U.S. wasn't even in there. It would have been, England, Spain, and Netherlands, basically.
And I think that point should really be emphasized. Like Portugal colonized, France colonized, Spain colonized, England, of course, did. The Netherlands, they had like a few small disparate colonies, but never the same footprint.
Right. And their intent was never to export Dutch culture.
No.
Unlike everybody else.
I wonder what the thinking was behind that, because that's not par for the course for Europeans at that time.
Well, and that's one of the things that goes to the aspect of Protestantism, and especially Calvinism. Calvinism is not a go out and get new adherents.
Yeah, it was far less inclined than some of the other Protestants, especially. Yeah.
So the Calvinists weren't out there saying, hey, come be like us. Hey, come be Calvinist. And most of the Calvinism that was going on in agricultural and rural areas. So that becomes one of the impetuses, because as globalization is occurring in urban areas, it is changing at least part of the religious landscape of Holland. And so much of those Protestant Calvinists, the really hardcore ones, left to the New World, which is the only place they were going to find any given religious freedom. And in the process, again, they didn't bring their culture to teach it to everybody else. They brought their culture as their own piece. You know, their intent was never to make everybody else Dutch. You know, their intent was, well, and it's great because talking to some of the really old early Dutch immigrants to Lynden, when I first started at the museum, I remember one lady was telling me, she's like, because I was asking her, like, you know, so what is it like to be Dutch in America? She looks at me funny. She says, I'm American. I'm not Dutch. I stopped being Dutch when I immigrated. But you still speak Dutch. You still, you know, do these things. She says, those aren't Dutch things. Those are church things. I speak Dutch because I'm supposed to, because that's what you speak in church. I dress this way because that's how God intended you to dress.
Right.
You know? And so it's interesting what the Dutch carry that people think of as Dutch culture isn't actually Dutch culture. It's rural Calvinistic Dutch culture.
That's interesting, because that's one of the things that I've noticed a lot, just like everyone knows it, but in especially Latin America, you see that Catholicism and Latin culture, very integrated. in a lot of other Protestant, I think especially in like the English Protestant world, there is that division between what is cultural, what is civil, and what is church. Just greater divisions between those. The Dutch, that line was a little bit more blurred, a little bit more Catholic then.
Yeah. Yeah, and so one of the things that does bother a lot of those early Dutch immigrants in the late 1800s, early 1900s is the burgeoning of new religions across Holland. Because after Catholicism, Holland became Protestant of many different types.
It's Duke of Orange. It doesn't. Yeah, whatever.
But the reason being is because under Catholic occupation, they were treated so horribly. Why would anybody want to be part of a religion like that? Why would anybody want to be part of a church that does that? So of course they became Protestant. Okay, and they became, for lack of a better term, militantly Protestant.
Yes.
You weren't going to change their mind now that they were Protestant.
They would flood the country if they have to.
Exactly. They were not going to let Catholics or anybody even looking like Catholics anywhere near Holland ever again. And so consequently, but then you get the globalization. And again, you get not just now Catholicism, you're getting all those different new Protestant groups, the new Reformed groups, the new Catholic groups. You're getting Eastern Orthodox Catholic Church. You know, you're getting a global mix now of religions. And many of the Protestants of Holland were like, no, Holland's disappearing. The Holland I love is gone. It's nothing but a bunch of, oddly enough, probably what a lot of them would say now, nothing but a bunch of liberal, progressive, globalist elites, you know, trying to push their religious views down my throat. So they went elsewhere. Most of them came to the United States and Canada because religious freedom was sort of guaranteed and was one of the few places in the world at that point in time that would guarantee your religious freedom.
Right.
But again, they didn't come here to make everybody else Protestant. They just came here to be allowed to practice their own Protestantism, their own Calvinism, be their own religion, do their own church. Other than that, like I said, it was interesting because they were American. Other than that, outside of church, they would dress like Americans, or what they perceived to be American dress at the time,
right?
Type of a thing. But if you went to church, you wore specific. I mean, they used to wear what you think of as the church Dutch Sunday going clothes,
right?
You know, so it was interesting. But that's the first wave. Then you start getting different waves coming, and it's interesting to see. It was interesting to see the difference between the post World War II Dutch.
Yeah, I remember hearing about that because huge amounts of Dutch came to Canada specifically, I know.
Yes, yeah. Well, I mean, that was the Dutch government in exile went to Canada. So Queen, what's her name, and the King lived out the Nazi occupation in Canada.
I did not know that.
And Dutch troops even participated in some Pacific theater aspects.
Really?
Yes. Oh. Yeah. And then the other Dutch military would, under Allied rule, I'm trying to remember which battles. There was a couple of battles in which Dutch military in Europe were, but they were not Dutch. They were Dutch conscripts in the English army, if that makes sense. There was some way, England was very good at doing things like that, where they would take other countries' militaries and fold them in to their military.
Yeah, that is a very English thing to do. This is a bit of an aside, but I remember always going through the histories and I see all these great things about what the English did. It's like, oh, it's cool, but I'm pretty sure Canada was in here too. I'm pretty sure Australia was in here too. Yeah. I was like, oh, wait, that was us. They just took the credit for themselves.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, that's the beautiful thing about being part of the Commonwealth.
Yeah.
And there's one thing that I think is now really sort of a funny aside, and that is in 40 years, because Prince Harry was born in the United States, he'll be eligible to run for U.S. president.
Oh my God.
Prince Harry's son.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
You know, so that English monarchy is always thinking ahead about the colonies.
There's going to be some American patriot on the East Coast who's like, I'm pretty sure I fought so that this didn't happen again. Oh, that's good. Okay, so keeping loosely with Lynden.
Yeah, so with that, so they bring these traditions, and for the Dutch, these are church traditions. They're traditions they're absolutely not going to change. And already in Lynden, you had some level of support, although Lynden was I mean, Lynden's first church was a Methodist church. The first church in the vast majority of U.S. and Canadian communities was a Methodist church, simply because the Methodists were really good at getting circuit preachers out there. If you're a Methodist man back then, you got yourself baptized as a pastor, and you headed out into the West to bring the God to the infidels type of a thing. And so consequently, the first church in England was a Methodist church, but it was really an ecumenical church. You had Baptists. Baptist church was the second church in Lynden. So you had Baptists going there. Phoebe Judson wasn't Methodist. She helped establish it as a Methodist church because the Methodist church would supply a pastor and would supply all these, basically pay for the church. But she was an avowed Christian Scientist.
Christian Scientist? Really?
Yes. That's one of the myths. There's still people in Lynden who do not want to accept that she was Christian Science.
So what does that exactly entail? Because we're talking 1870 for Phoebe Judson.
Christian Science comes out in the burgeoning teachings of Christian Science, and I cannot remember. There was the two main authors. For life, I can't remember their names. Or in the 1850s, 1860s. Christian Science as a denomination really doesn't establish itself until the 1880s. But she had in her belongings, what's left through the family, her letters. She refers to those early authors of Christian Science teachings. She later attends the first Christian Science church in Bellingham when she's still alive. So she was even coming to Lynden.
It seems like a
Christian Scientist.
Seems like a pretty heterodox belief, then.
What do you mean by heterodoxy on that one?
It's outside of what is typically orthodox. So,
all of Christian Science was. That one still is by my Christian beliefs.
But that's the thing. Like, I'm vaguely aware of Christian Science. Like, can you unpack some of the distinctives?
The most important aspect of Christian Science is that Christian scientists believe that science is the measure by which we can find the measure of creation, and that the Bible is almost entirely metaphor. So the Great Flood did not happen. It's a metaphor, and science can prove it. But then Christian scientists can also turn around, and there are aspects that they look to. Some of the things we were talking about is concepts of repeating patterns of accession events, or just that absurdity is God's hand.
Right.
And so Christian scientists will turn around then and say, but look at the frequency by which these things happen. There is no other way by which this can happen in a purely mathematically chaotic system.
These natural phenomenons that are so coincidental and random by the mere fact that they've happened in such a way that this is allowed to, this good deed has happened. That's providence. That's the Lord's working. Okay.
Right. So that would be the equivalent of a miracle. Christian scientists felt that they could prove miracles in a scientific fashion, using the scientific method as opposed to the religious method of philosophical or logical debate. So
that really does mean then that this church that was first being established in Lynden, a lot of divergent thoughts. That's interesting. Yeah. So Lynden's general divergent. Generally, the pioneer Lynden would have been religiously very diverse. Probably with Methodism and Baptism as being the two main, most recognizable of those religions. So it wasn't until the Dutch came with the Calvinistic Reformed traditions that there wasn't really a clearly dominant church then. No, you're not going to get something like some of the communities that you'll find back east and in the Midwest where they were settled by an ethnic group initially. There was nobody there so like the town my Luginbill family hails from, Bern, Indiana, is a Mennonite community. The Mennonite church is like the only church and it is the single largest church. Occupying blocks in the middle of town. I've got Mennonite family. I've seen those kinds of towns. And so and that was what many of those pieces did. But the Dutch didn't do that. The Calvinistic Dutch didn't do it because they weren't coming to settle as Dutch. They were coming to settle as Americans. Right. But maintain their Protestant Calvinistic views and maintain their church views. And so what that means in Lynden is that when they get to here, although there is a diverse view, there are diverse views religiously in Lynden,
some of those pieces, there are already views that may not be religious views that can be taken up and were already championed by Protestant Calvinists. One of those being the issues of Sunday, the Sabbath, working and drinking and dancing. Okay. So while on one hand you would have Phoebe Judson, Ed Edson, the first pastor of the Methodist Reformed Church, and a couple members of not Dr. Lucy Sark, what was her name? But she, and then like maybe a couple members or the first pastor of the first Christian Reformed Church sit down, and they would disagree on the tulip principles and what type of grace is saving grace, and as we've discussed, that legalistic aspect of Calvinism. But they would all agree on the moral aspects of certain things, such as resting on a Sunday.
Okay.
In Phoebe Judson's book, A Search for a Pioneer, a Pioneer's Search for an Ideal Home, she talks specifically about how her trip across the Oregon Trail was made easier because they observed the Sabbath on Sundays. They were one of the few that instead of trying to make it across in the shortest period of time would take one day of rest every 6 days.
Right.
And consequently, they would, even though they would watch as these guys would pass them, by the time they got close, they'd pass them. You know, so it wasn't just a good idea that God gave us. It was a practical idea as well.
Interesting.
Okay. Similar situations in regards to dancing. Dancing led to impure thoughts. Impure thoughts led to infidelity or adultery or pre-marriage consummation.
Yeah, figure that one out.
You know, and so consequently, the best thing, just don't dance. Don't tempt yourself. You know, liquor, same thing.
Right.
You get drunk, you do stupid things. Why get drunk in the first place? So this was the logic that existed among many of the pioneers here. And so when the Protestant Calvinism arrived with all these same ideas backed up with the Word of God, it became real easy for then Lynden to go ahead and say, we're already doing that. So yeah, keep doing it. More power to you. You're just another reason to keep people from working on a Sunday and not drink and not dance. And, but it was still an American community, and it was still the West.
So it seems like the primary defining quality then of Lynden really was this, I want to say conservative, not in strictly the political sense, but more in the temperamental sense. It was this conservative Christian town.
Not even a temperamental. It was just a conservative town, a temperance town.
Like it knew what it liked, it knew what worked, and it wasn't interested in bringing in too many new radical elements.
Exactly.
Gotcha.
Exactly.
How do you think that compared to the rest of Whatcom County, though?
Oh, wow. That would depend upon the community.
Oh, that much, eh?
Yeah. I mean, Bellingham, well, all the border towns, Bellingham, Blaine, and Sumas were going through constant cycles of boom and bust based upon what resources were being used at the time.
Right.
So Bellingham starts out, big fisheries town, lots of fish. The fishery starts going away. Coal mines are there. So then the coal mines pop up. A lot of people. Then the coal mines start going away. Then it's the gold rush. And by that point in time, there's enough general population in Bellingham to keep Bellingham going. But at one point in time, early on in the 1870s, Bellingham and Lynden were about the same size. There were about 200, 300 people.
Nowadays, you'd be forgiven if you didn't know that.
Well, exactly. You know, and that's the thing. It's Sumas. I love Sumas history because it is just constant boom and bust based upon what's going on either side of the border,
right?
And whether or not that town is situated in a place to take economic advantage of that and what's going on across the border. So, and in Blaine is similar, only you had the fisheries going with it.
Right.
So it had a long, strong history of the fisheries.
I suppose Blaine also had a smaller history of being flooded out like Sumas does.
Well, there is always that issue, too, that Sumas is not exactly the most ideally situated place geographically.
No. Good heavens, yeah.